Welcome to Torah Smash, the podcast for nerdy Jews, where our lives of Jewish learning collide with our love of nerd culture. In each episode, we discuss what we lovingly call a Torah Smash, which we have defined as a beautiful collision of one thing from the world of Judaism with another from nerd culture. I'm Ethan Lane Miller, and joining me today are
Barack Malkin,
RDY,
and Betsy Stone.
Yay!
Dr. Betsy Stone is back.
I'm
Betsy,
very lucky to be back with you.
We're so happy to have you. Betsy is a retired psychologist who now uses her wisdom, experience, and passion as an engaging speaker and teaches throughout North America and Europe. She serves as a scholar in residence for congregations and clergy groups and has led webinars and seminars for organizations like Hillel, Hebrew Union College, and the Jewish Education Project as they navigate the complexities of their personal and professional roles. For Betsy, a day is not complete without Wordle, Quirtle, Spelling Bee, and the New York Times crossword. We're welcoming to Torah Smash for the second time, Dr. Betsy Stone.
Yay!
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me back. I have to tell you, I've become a connections and strands lover as well, even though sometimes I have to figure out what the words mean on connections. But if it's a game, I want to play it. So
I got connections backwards yesterday where I got
me too.
Yeah.
Me too. I don't think I've ever gotten it quite completely backwards, but
Yeah, yesterday was my first time too. Just the way my brain figured it out.
Right. Or I was going to say the way your brain worked or didn't work.
Usually didn't.
Yeah, that's the case for many of us.
But
so
today's purple I got quickly because Deadpool.
Oh, not me. Because I'm not a nerd. I'm sorry.
You are plenty nerdy and nerd adjacent, Betsy. We're very happy to have you. So for today's episode, I feel a little bit like Captain America sitting down to give like an after school special video in Spider-Man, because this episode is coming out pretty close to the anniversary of Kaya's death. And so with this love and support of I almost called you co-workers, with the love and support of my co-hosts, I wanted to do a 1-year check-in, knowing that so much has happened. There's been so much to think about. And I, of course, knew if I wanted to have a guest, I wanted it to be Betsy, who exists at the intersection of many, many of these things.
Can I just clarify before? We have just been calling you Betsy and Betsy Stone. I need to give you the proper... It feels weird to every time somebody says it, in my head I go, doctor, because it just... you've earned that title. I just want the listeners who may not know you, you are Dr. Betsy Stone. I just want them to have that knowledge that we have.
But I have known the three of you for so long and in so many different ways that formality feels excessive at this point.
Oh, that's fine. This is more for RDY sister Susan, who's not familiar with you.
What's interesting
well,
is
I was worried about her.
when I hang out with RDY on the weekends, I still call him Rabbi.
He does. It's kind of weird.
Wow. I'm sorry, David. I'm not gonna call you Rabbi.
I knew that. That's fine by me.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
Ethan also just wanted to plug that we hang out on weekends occasionally.
Yeah, no, that was
Slightly.
nice. I caught it.
It annoys. Yeah. Look.
So wait a minute. I have a question for you. I can't remember because the world moves too fast for me. Did Kaya die before October 7th or after?
It's a really, really good question, Betsy. She died November 8th. And this episode is slated to come out November 6th, I believe.
Okay. So I think it is actually important for us to layer the griefs here and to say that human beings often, maybe always, don't exist in a simple space of this grief or that grief, this disruption or that disruption. And surely in the world in which we have inhabited for the last year, and the world we are careening towards with an election just a few weeks away, there is a sense of kind of bombardment of griefs that it's not that I finish with a grief and move to the next. And in fact, our brains store grief in a space that doesn't actually have language. And so in new griefs, we replicate old griefs, we pull up old griefs. For most of us, for all of us, the last 4 years, the last 8 years have been periods of really extensive loss and disruption, and on a communal basis, and also on a personal basis. And so we don't get respite from grief. We don't, people talk about getting over. We don't actually ever get over grief, as we don't actually ever get over trauma. But there is this process of grief upon grief upon grief, loss upon loss upon loss. And it's cumulative as well as individual. Was that English?
Yeah.
Completely. And I think it's also important to repeat that Ethan mentioned that this episode comes out on November 6th, which is the day after half of our country will be suffering some sort of loss.
If we know anything at that point. I'm not sure we will know anything.
If we know anything by the time this comes out. But to acknowledge that no matter who wins the election, and we all hope that our person wins, the rest, again, it's a tight race, and half of our community, possibly half of our congregants, if we are a part of a congregation, half of the country will be experiencing loss and grief.
Yep.
Have any of you had a loss around another major event in your life that added to it? Just how we're talking about Ethan's loss just after October 7th. I'm trying to think of my other major losses, and I don't think there were any world events. They were mostly life changes, right? My mom passed away the week after I graduated college, so there's this big shift in life. I wasn't near my friends as often as I was. And then my grandma had passed away when I was living in California, nowhere near the rest of my family to be able to sit and be with them. But I don't think I've had any major events pairing with a loss that I've experienced. And I'm wondering if any of you have had anything similar.
My father died while my father-in-law was having surgery, and I couldn't get hold of anyone to come and take the children and help me.
Wow.
I don't know if that counts.
It's a similar one thing on top of another stressed piece. Yeah.
Well, and we tend to think that these things are simply additive, like there's a bad thing that happens and then another bad thing that happens. But in fact, our ability to respond in ways that make us proud is compromised and compromised again and compromised again. And so it's not that I get good at grief, but in fact, I think what happens is that my ability to function well diminishes very quickly.
Yeah. It's not funny, but it's interesting that the day she died, when I was at work, we got a presentation from member of the board and our CEO who did like a solidarity trip to Israel, and they toured some of the, one of the kibbutz that was hit, and it was just overwhelming. And that's how I started my day. I started my day in the state of overwhelming. And since then, I selfish is the wrong connotation, but I've been very inward focused. Like, I haven't had the ability to process the losses, that the community is feeling. I haven't had the ability to process the images out of Israel. I haven't had the time to process the images out of Gaza. Like, it's all just so overwhelming. And I've had to make the choice of I've got my own stuff to deal with. I can't spend a lot of mental energy holding on to this and processing it.
Which is really a form, Ethan, of self-protection, and not something to be judged, because self-protection is healthy. It's wise. It is those moments when I say, I really can't do any more, so I'm going to stop. And we often think, look, one of the great misnomers about grief is we think that you can accelerate it and then it will get better if you go through it faster. And I'm here to say I think there is absolutely no evidence of that. I think, in fact, that as we try to accelerate grief, we actually slow it down.
How do you accelerate grief?
Oh, you throw yourself into it. You say to yourself, I'm going to really focus on this. I'm going to do all the things that are excruciatingly painful.
Okay, gotcha.
But to throw your teaching back at you, wouldn't that be not dealing with grief, but dealing with loss?
Yes, exactly. So what David's talking about, I'm sorry, I don't think of you as RDY. I think of you as David.
Please. As your student, I would expect nothing less.
Thank you. The difference between grief and loss is, I think, actually incredibly important. We focus a lot on loss. We spend a lot of time thinking about loss. Loss is what happens, what we're thinking about through most of Shloshim. We are thinking about procuring a casket and a burial place and who's going to bring food for Shiva and what do I need to get done? I'm sorry, go ahead, Dave.
Just to remind Jason, who is Barak's non-Jewish friend, Shiva is the 7-day intense period of mourning immediately after a funeral. Shloshim is the slightly less intense 30-day period after a funeral.
Right. And most of what we're focusing on during that time is really about loss. It's about, it may be, what do I do with people's clothing or the dog's bowl? I mean, because our grief is not limited to the deaths of humans. It's about, how do I pack up the stuff in my office? Those are all loss related. They're not grief related. Loss is, in many senses, I think loss is infinitely more practical. And grief follows us around like a shadow and isn't about what tasks do I need to get done. Tasks make things easier. Grief is not about tasks. Grief is actually about beginning to see the world as a world in which something that I've treasured no longer exists. Whether it is a dream, whether it is a person, whether it is an understanding. I think that for many of us, the election in 2016 was the death of a dream. I thought I knew where I lived. I think for many of us, the experience of October 7th was the death of an understanding. Israel is a safe place. I can always go there. This is a place where Jews are safe. Those are very different than, Ethan, your sense that Kaya loved you enough that she would suffer for you, which is, I actually think, part of what we believe about love. You will put up with things because you love me. And I think that part of what grief is integrating a world that I didn't know existed into the world in which I live. A world I didn't know existed, a world that has a certain level of pain into the world that I thought I knew.
I mean, my conception of things, my experience with things is now totally different. I don't remember how soon after she died I made the decision, but I decided to rewatch my favorite Star Trek series, the best series, which is Deep Space Nine. And it's known for being like actually one of the like darkest and kind of morally ambiguous Star Trek incarnations. And so, spoiler, Barack, for when you eventually get there, but one of the main characters dies at the end of season 6. And it's a big moment.
I've seen them. I'm just, for the listeners, okay. Ethan's referring to, I am currently watching all of the Star Trek properties in order from the original series, but I've seen many of the Star Trek shows from growing up. My dad never changed a channel from sci-fi, and so I've seen Voyager, Deep Space Nine, Next Gen, all of the stuff.
Great.
So no, it's not a spoiler for me. I appreciate it.
So
are you watching them in release order or stardate order?
Release order.
I'm sure someone out there has the stardate order.
You can't do it because
I knew to ask that.
But you can't because Pike's season is going on right now and hasn't finished.
That's true.
So I can't actually fulfill that.
Has Pike's season peaked?
No, not yet.
Peak, Paramount Plus. It's a mountain. It's all circular.
I am
Which is
totally
part of
lost.
it.
I'll bring it back a little bit.
Okay,
So-
thank you. Bless you, Ethan.
So Jadzia dies at the end of season 6, and it's like throwing a boulder into a pond. Cisco, who's the captain, withdraws into himself. And we have seen him over the course of 6 years deal with a lot of stuff. We see him take a leave of absence from the station, and the other characters on the station understand how serious it is. They walk into his office and see that he took his baseball off of his desk. And Major Kira goes, uh-oh, he's not sure he's going to be back. And Worf, who was married to Jadzia, like just watching him go through this grief and mourning and loss, it suddenly hit me so very differently. One of the things Worf does at the start of the next season is he's very ornery. He's very upset. The other character's like, well, yeah, it makes sense. And we realize that Worf still has to do some ritual things for himself. So, he has to go do on this particular mission because otherwise Jadzia is not going to get into Klingon heaven, which is interesting because Jadzia wasn't Klingon. He was Klingon.
No, but what you're raising, Ethan, is this idea that survivors have responsibility. And that's not just the responsibility of creating mourning rituals. It's the responsibility of maintaining memories. And in a Jewish space, that is critically important because so much of what we're taught is of the kind of blessing, curse, and responsibility of memory. From the message that we have to remember Amalek and blot out his name, think about Sinwar as well. We don't get to ignore history. History really matters. Maintaining history really matters.
I had a really funny moment with my therapist when I asked her, is there ever going to be a day that I don't think of her? And then I said, that's a really funny thing for me to ask when I just got her handwriting tattooed on my arm. And so I'm holding it in kind of these two somewhat contradictory spheres of, like, on the one hand, I want to hang on to it so desperately. I feel this call to speak for her, to carry on that memory. And on the other hand, like, maybe I don't like saying the word burden, but it's a responsibility. It's a heavy responsibility.
Ethan, if you had asked me that question, I would have said, I sure hope not. I hope you think about her every day, and that it's not that you go through the pain of grief every day, but that you take the time to lovingly remember her every day.
Yeah, I think I've gotten to a point with my mom's passing, right? She passed away now about 16 years ago. And I think I've gotten to a point where there are those rare moments, right? My kid is now starting to read. My mom was an elementary school teacher, and boy, do I wish she could have read some of the books she read to me in her class to him, right? But I don't have the pain anymore. It's more of like a really fond memory. I'm so happy that she gave that to me, that I can pass that along.
I think, Barack, what you're teaching us, and I know it is incredibly important for us all to remember, is that the actual facts of the stories don't change, but the experience of the facts of the stories change dramatically. And so, I mean, this is Torah in its most unvarnished form. The story that's in the text is the story that's in the text. But the story that the text tells me is a radically different story than the story it used to teach me.
Yeah.
Right? The story I heard that I read in the text, and any story that I read in the text is different today than it was 20 years ago, even though the words haven't changed one bit. And I think that is the integration of grief. That I then am a person who has been changed by grief, has been altered by grief, and I understand the world differently because of grief.
I also want to jump back real quick and point out, just so you know, Betsy, is that Ethan mentioned Worf. Worf is subcanonically Jewish, raised by adoptive where he was
Yes.
adopted and raised by like Russian Jewish parents. Maybe Jewish, maybe not Jewish. Definitely on the Jewish side. So these like experiences of his grief, I think the writers subtly utilize some of the Jewish burden, guilt, whatever that culturally are maybe known for, and put that into the story. I just wanted to make sure I knew that you probably were not aware of Worf's character. Just I thought you'd enjoy
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. It is very nice to be understood as somebody who doesn't understand. So, Ethan, it makes me wonder, and you're a year into this, which is not the same thing as being 2 years into this or 5 years into this, or as Barack points out, 16 years into it. How has the story changed for you? And you should feel free to change the subject if you don't like that answer, that question.
Yeah, I think I need to think out loud for a little bit.
Is a terrible place for that.
It's really, really interesting. I made a choice pretty early on that I wanted to be public.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that I necessarily very clearly defined what it was I wanted to be public with. I think it was initially focused on Kaya's story, which I now am coming to realize is Kaya's story through my eyes, through what I experienced. Because really, the only one who can tell her story is her.
Mm-hmm.
So now we are left kind of piecing it together through our all very valid interactions and experiences. And so I think initially I very much wanted to be public to talk about her, both from the standpoint of wanting to celebrate who she was, the type of person that she was, as well as talk about the mental illness portion of this. And I have come to realize that another important part of this conversation is also me. And that's why I think that I'm changing the language a little bit, and that it's Kaya's story as I understood it, or that it's our story, and understanding that it's deeply intertwined into the grief. And so I think when I approached the first episode of talking about this a year ago, I came into it with the intention of talking about Kaya and mental illness. And I left, I think I definitely talked about grief and loss. And heading into this episode, I really decided, no, I want to really focus on the grief and loss side of it. And so certainly my interactions are different. I don't know if y'all have watched Parks and Recreation, but there's when the character Chris gets a therapist, Dr. Richard Nygaard, and he's like, my twice a week sessions, and he keeps name dropping his therapist. So I don't want to be that. But something I talked about with my therapist, who she is just delightful, was that I sorted things into the past, present, and future when it came to loss. And so I defined, in my box of, what is the present, there's I can't share this article with her. I can't text her. I can't just be like, oh, hey, I'll grab dinner on the way back from work. We can meet up. There's the past where nothing actually changed, but there's a slightly different tint through which I'm viewing those memories and those things that took place. And then there's the future, which is in some ways very nebulous. What made this last year, one of the things that was so interesting to navigate through this past year was time, literally navigating through time and going through calendar appointments of things that we had planned out and marking the transition from things that we had definitively planned and that were in some level of on the calendar, transitioning into things that were, oh, now I'm just left with the nebulous things that we had wanted to do. And it was part of the motivation for me and my siblings to go to Disney World earlier this month, because Kaya and I had talked about going to Disney World so that I could spend literally all of my money at Galaxy's Edge. And she made me a piggy bank and like decorated with like Star Wars stickers and stuff all over it so that I could start saving for this trip together we were going to take. And so I was partially motivated to like fulfill one of these future things. And so I did that thing that we wanted to do. I went to Savi's workshop and did the make your own lightsaber experience. But I didn't make a lightsaber for me. I made it for her. The design, everything I picked was inspired by her. And it felt right. It felt so right.
There's an interesting aspect of this, which is, I think, part of what mourners do, which is that we have some sense of responsibility for the memory of that person. And it's really, so you make a saber for Kaya that she's not able to make, but it's striking to me as the story of her life and death has to change as your life continues, that we still have this sense of both, I want to remember you, and maybe I'm obligated to remember you. What will it be like when that day happens where you think to yourself, I didn't think about her at all today?
Well, I did ask my therapist that. And what we decided was it will feel weird.
Mm-hmm.
And part of me will feel sad. And then I will probably still think of her the next day.
Yep, exactly.
I want to say two things. First, I don't know if, Betsy, you said this on purpose or accident, or I misheard you. I thought you said Lifesaber, and I think that's
I did.
I want to say I think it's a wonderful representation of what Ethan may have made.
Yep.
As opposed to a lightsaber, that it was sort of for Kaya. So that's a little bit beautiful. I really love that. And then second, the piggy bank story sounds identical to the movie Up.
Yes.
They started this piggy bank together, and the wife had passed away, Ellie, and then he continued and finally saw it as like, I have to do this trip that we had planned on, and did the trip. And then at the end found that it was, I don't know if you had one of these moments that Carl Fredricksen had in the film where you get to Galaxy's Edge and you realize it wasn't about that, right? Like he wanted to move his whole house there. That was, he promised her, I have to do the thing I promised. And on the trip discovered like life's adventure is what it was about. So I don't know if you had a moment like that you'd like to share, or that you did not have an epiphany because your life is not a Pixar movie, but I just wanted to throw that out there.
I mean, first, I haven't made that connection. So thank you, Barack. That I'm going to dwell on that for a little bit. I mean, going to Galaxy's Edge, there really was only one moment of, oh my gosh, feeling very sad. The rest of it was just fun. And I mean, part of it was that, I mean, the Galaxy's Edge portion was very me focused and by extension focused on Kaya, but it was overall in this trip that was also celebrating my youngest sister, being officially, cured from cancer, which was its own big deal. There were a lot of feelings on this trip to Disney World. And thankfully most of them were very positive. I had this one moment of just, I'd say, feeling the feels, but otherwise just, it was an amazing trip. And part of me definitely was and is so sad that she didn't get to experience it together, because we would have just had the grandest time imaginable. It would have been so great. And yet, even with all of that, it was just such a great trip. I wish some of the reasons behind it were different, but the trip was what it needed to be.
So, Ethan, I think that part of the way the trip was what it needed to be was that you were able to experience joy. And human beings are able to hold conflicting emotions. I think it's one of the great blessings of being human. I'm just not convinced the giraffes could do this.
Maybe
maybe dolphins, maybe elephants. But I think that the ability to laugh at a beautiful eulogy is actually one of the things that sustains us as human beings. And that grief doesn't have to be though at times it is. It does not have to be all encompassing. It can be part of what I feel, but not necessarily all of what I feel. So that, Barak, in the moment that you are reading with your child and saying, I wish my mom was here, there is sadness, but there's also enormous joy at the memory of what your mom gave you and taught you and who she helped you become.
It's way more joy than it has been in the past. It's less of a sad, upset feeling now. And I don't know why that shift happened, but I'm glad that it did. The perspective of those memories is very different from when she wasn't there to walk me down the aisle at my wedding or be there for my baby's births. Like, these memories of my mom now have a very different impact, very different feeling than they did. And I don't know if I'm going through grief different. If it's different than other people, if it's a different phase, then my sister's in a very different phase of her grief than I am. And so I know everybody's experiences are unique. Yeah.
I think that part of what you're describing is this sense, and I think we've talked about this a little bit in terms of Kaya as well, that I keep you alive by loving you, even when you're gone. And that a sense of who these people are is something that I can hold on to even when they're not here any longer. I can hold on to my mother reading with my mother.
I think that's one of the most beautiful things about the Jewish mourning process in particular, that number one, that we encourage each other to re-evoke and to stoke the flames of memory, so to speak.
To tell stories.
To tell stories and to observe Yizkor 4 times a year. And also the way the mourning process itself, I've been wanting to say this for a little while, but haven't had an opening. So the process that a Jewish mourner goes through suffering a recent death, it is, I think, the perfect construction when observed properly, meaning the timing worked very well for me, meaning that the people around you are the ones who are supposed to, in quotes, be dealing with the loss so that you can deal with the grief. You know, when a loved one dies, and with much love and respect to you, Barak, I do not euphemize at all when I talk about death. I use the word death and died and dying. I don't say past because it sounds like a bodily function to me.
I don't think I do that consciously. I think I use the phrases interchangeably. Maybe I could be wrong.
I think most of us are trained to make death pretty, and so we use the word past or gone or lost, which has always been one of my bugaboos. It's who lost somebody they loved,
right? I have a Dumbledorian philosophy about it, where like fear of calling it out by name increases the fear of the thing itself.
That's fascinating.
So all of the logistics around the process of mourning. So when a loved one has died and you go to your home to sit Shiva, your community is supposed to have covered the mirrors if you want them to, and put out the boxes if you're going to sit on them, and
brought food,
bring food, all the food, so that you can not worry about it, so that you can focus on dealing with the grief. And I think that that's a very beautiful thing. I know it helped me, and I hope it helps others that I encourage to observe these practices.
I was overwhelmed. Like, I was emotionally overwhelmed by her death, and I was emotionally overwhelmed by the support I received. And one we would, classify more negatively, one we'd classify more positively. But just when I think about that whole period in time, like, the word that comes to mind is just overwhelming. I was so overwhelmed by everything. And also, I'm so glad I had the support. I don't know what I would have done without it.
I want to jump back to this topic of loss versus death or dying.
Loss versus grief?
No, the
words.
Use of the words.
The euphemisms.
Yeah.
Euphemisms.
My family's been to 3 unveilings in the last 2 months, which meant that a year ago we attended 3 funerals in a span of about 3 or 4 months. And my children have come to all of them because they were close family members or close friends and wanted them to be there for that. Last year, they were 3 and 5. This year, they are 4 and 6. And so I think last year I was a little more cautious with the words. And I think I described it to them as we are going to celebrate the life of this person or that person. But then this year at the unveilings, I remember we pulled up and one of them said, "Hey, where are all the shovels? Like, this is the experience you have when you go to a cemetery." And we then had to explain like the different phases of passing and burial and all these. I'm seeing passing, death. I think Betsy's right. I think I've been trained to use a more passive term. I'm not afraid of it. Which is so fascinating. I don't think I'm afraid of it because I am openly talking and asking. Like in the last unveiling, my wife walked the cemetery with the boys when they couldn't like stand still and couldn't hear the person. And like they asked questions about they were mostly footstones at the cemetery. So some headstones, but like asked questions about the footstones and the headstones. And my wife answered them and they read things because he can read now. And so we're not steering them away from this idea of death and dying and burial. But I don't know how this will translate later in life. If this was like practice makes perfect, I don't want them to have that experience. But I think it's important that when these things come up, you address them and don't hide away from it.
For sure.
So, one of the things that we believe in psychological theory is that the concept of permanence doesn't really exist for kids under 5.
Right.
That when you say to your 4-year-old, Uncle Johnny is being buried now, a part of his response is going to be, what will he eat? Because death doesn't make sense simply because it's permanent. That children want to put stuffed animals in graves because Nana always liked that one, and I don't want her to be lonely. The idea of death is actually a concept which requires some ability to do abstract thinking. And so in many ways, the covering language, the language of past and lost and gone, is actually consistent with the way little children think about death. Okay, I know that grandpa died, but when is he coming to my birthday party? Which is really typical for small children. A 6-year-old is beginning to understand this concept that once you're dead, you're always dead. You're never going to not be dead. And so there is this, again, it's in that same category as of the facts don't change, but the story as I understand it changes. And what your boys understand now, Barack, is different than what they will understand in a year or 2 years.
Yeah. And none of the people, they were not overly close with any of those that had passed away. It was
died.
That had passed, died, that had
died.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I didn't say that to make you correct yourself.
Shuffled off this mortal coil.
Join the choir in Visibule.
Picked up their lifesaber. Right. It was my mom's sister and her husband, and it was a very close family friend who I grew up with, like hanging out with her kids. And so my kids never really had any connections, mostly because of COVID. Like they probably would have known my aunt and uncle if COVID didn't happen.
Right.
Like we had some lawn meetings with them in COVID, but post-COVID, like they were often sick or, other medical stuff. So they didn't have that connection. So they haven't lost anybody close to them, quote, yet. So I don't know.
And my guess is when they lose people who are close to them, they will have this same question of, when are they coming back? In the same, which is very similar in kind of psychologically with what Ethan, I'm sure you've done, which is to pick up the phone to call Kaya. And, there is an unreality to loss that lasts a long time.
Mm-hmm.
That just because my logical brain understands that loss is permanent, it does not mean that my emotional or psychological brain does.
It's brutal when the person you want to call to talk to about how you're feeling about someone who died is the person who died.
Yes,
Yeah.
It is.
it's brutal. Yeah, that is the right word for it.
I had called my grandma every week. I called my grandma once a week, and then she passed away, and like that reminder had to come up all the time. And then my aunt that had passed away, she had sort of created this, oh, you didn't call me last Friday. I was worried. Like, okay, now I have to call you every Friday. And now I don't call her every Friday. Right. It was a
Yeah.
weird shift of with the first time that reminder popped up. And then like it's a weird thing of wanting to call. And I have voicemails, and now I've started saving voicemails for all my loved ones, people, family, friends, so that if I wanted, I could hear their voice after they've died. I said died, RDY. Just wanted to point that out. And
I'm not critiquing you. I'm just explaining my practices.
and sometimes it's nice to have that and to share it with others who didn't think they'd hear that sound again. It's an interesting practice, but yeah.
So I think what we're talking about, a lot of what we're talking about, is that the experience of grief is symphonic. It's not monochromatic. It is multi-layered. Each bit of it is different than the bit before. And as we experience it, it changes. And so it continues to disrupt us. The disruption is disrupting. And I think as a culture, and now I'm not talking about Jews, I'm talking about Americans, we kind of believe that people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps and get over it. You know, people die, dogs die, you lose your job. And I think that is both dehumanizing for grievers, but it also belittles the extraordinary power that exists in love. I mean, at core, I'm going to sound very philosophical here. Loving people is one of the greatest risks we take, because the danger in loving is, in some sense, both so much more rewarding and so much more profound than the danger of isolation. And I think I know that the people who I have loved who are no longer in my life, either from death or other kinds of losses, have still left emotional tattoos all over me. And that is testament to the power of human relationship. Yeah. And I'd go a step farther and say that when I think about, for example, Kaya, the relationship exists beyond her own existence, which I think is maybe a definition of love.
There's certainly my life before Kaya and then my life with Kaya. To kind of help bring us home a little bit, and if we want to quote Captain Kirk of the Starship Enterprise.
Is this finally going to be the smash of the episode?
Yeah, here's the smash. This is all the intro.
I thought Up was the smash.
Oh, that would be good.
That's a good one too. You said how we deal with death is at least as important as how we deal with life.
Yeah, because the death of someone I love doesn't end their influence on my life.
Yeah.
And it doesn't end the relationship.
My life is permanently changed. It was permanently changed anyway from meeting Kaya.
Mm-hmm.
But that my whole trajectory now is different in ways I both can and cannot perceive.
Right. And the story will continue to unfold, because all good stories don't end at the end of the book.
Mm-hmm.
That's perfect.
Can I ask one final question tied to that, of this, like bringing us into the pop culture side? Do you guys have any favorite movies or stories related to death or grief, either directly or tangentially? Not to talk about it, just the titles.
My Life with Michael Keaton.
I just finished a novel that's a post-Second World War novel that's called The Safe Keep, which I have been recommending to people left, right, and center. And it is really about understanding the power of perception and dreams.
I think I would throw into the mix. We've already said Up, so I won't say Up, even though that's me saying Up a third time. I would add to the list Big Hero 6 and Onward. I think both had really great storylines about coping with the loss of a loved one.
Those are
I want to add one more. I
Yeah.
want to add the Phantom Toll Booth,
Oh,
which was absolutely one of my favorite books when I was a child. I read it and reread it and reread it. And I think what I loved about it was the understanding that all of our brains do different things with the same information.
so fascinating. Good pull.
It is not a movie about death necessarily, but as I was on the TikTok one day, some of the scenes from Good Will Hunting when Robin Williams' character is talking about death and the loss of his wife literally stopped me. It suddenly hit so differently.
Yeah, I can see that. Because the story doesn't change, but the story changes totally.
Those weird random human moments, those things that only I know. It's very interesting to say that I now can say I know things no other human knows.
And yet, of course you do.
Yeah.
Of course you do.
Oh boy.
And maybe I'm leading a group on Wednesday night where the focus is really going to be on what makes us human.
On Simchat Torah?
Yeah, why not? What makes us human? Well, is it the reinterpretation of a story? Is it the way that I can look at the exact same data and understand something radically different? And maybe that is exactly what makes us in the image of God.
Sounds like a perfect Simchat Torah message.
Yeah, doesn't it? Thank you. Now I can call you Rabbi.
Betsy,
don't, or I will have to mourn the loss of our.
We're well running out of time, but before we go, are there any closing thoughts or things you would want to plug?
Yeah, I want you to have me back. I love talking to the three of you.
We love having you.
So have me back. So I think when you say things I want to plug, I'm supposed to tell you what I've been doing that I've been really enjoying. I've been doing a bunch of scholar in residence at synagogues, which I think is marvelous because I get to teach people about a whole bunch of different things that are additive, which makes me really happy. And I get to build some relationships with people that are more substantive.
If people want to have you as a scholar in residence, how can they do that? Where can they find that information?
They can go to my website, which is betsystonphd.com. Miracles happen that was available. And what I think about a lot in this particular moment in time is identity. And what does it mean to be, not simply what does it mean to be Jewish, but what does it mean to be the kind of Jew I want to be and the kind of human I want to be at a time when a lot of my assumptions are challenged. So I feel like we live in interesting times, that old Chinese curse, or was it a Jewish curse? And I feel both cursed and blessed by that. I wouldn't want it any other way, and I would like to live in a world of peace.
Amen.
Amen.
Betsy, I want to bring you back for a third episode in another year. What is the topic we haven't touched on that you are an expert on that we need to have you for? And we'll find the nerd topic.
Question.
Gosh. Well, I'll be an expert on something different, hopefully. Then.
So we've done teshuva, we've done grief. Yeah. What is something else that I really wanted you for the South Park episode about adolescent personalities, but we didn't have you for that. So I
want to come back and talk about post-traumatic growth. The ways in which the bad things that happen in our lives teach us really important lessons that we will hold on to.
Amazing. We'll have you back for Star Wars Episode 2. That sounds great.
Okay.
Oh. Yeah, Star Wars Episode 2 was a bad thing.
It was pretty traumatic.
Yes.
Okay, I believe you. I'll even watch it for you if you want.
No.
Okay, yeah. I heard that. I love being with the three of you. Thank you so much. I am honored to come back and do this, and I will do it anytime.
Thank you, Betsy.
Thank you, Betsy.
Yeah.
And Ethan, if there's anything I could do to be helpful.
You have been in so many ways. I found the right therapist, and it made such a difference.
It's incredibly important.
It is.
Yep.
That'll do it for this episode of Torah Smash. Our fiscal sponsor is Jewish Creativity International. Our theme music was created by Sean Fogel. You can check out Sean's bands and studio work at www.thesleepywest.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to rate and review us wherever you listen. It helps others find us and is an excellent way to support the podcast. We want to hear from you and continue today's discussion. Go to torahsmash.com to find where to connect with us online, purchase swag from our store, support us with a donation, find previous episodes, and more. And a joke for our recent election day. Imagine it's Inauguration Day for America's first Jewish president. In the first row sits their mother. She taps the person sitting next to her on the shoulder. "You see the president up there?" she asks him. "Why, yes, ma'am, of course I do," they respond. The president mother replies, "Their sister is a doctor."
And otherwise, I just do what Ethan tells me to do, right?
Okay, before we get started, I just want to lay the ground rule that I want the three of you to feel free to ask me anything. I don't think there's anything off limits, but like, if there is, I'll tell you. It's literally one of the only things I can think of. Be like, All right.
Okay.
You ready?
Is there a better transition?
I want to know. What are you doing, Barack? What are you doing, David? What do you mean there's swag?
Swag.
We've got like shirts,
pillows, coffee
we all
mugs,
get.
clocks.
Okay.
Yeah. What do you want something, Betsy?
I'm going to go look.